The winter did not announce itself with miracles or omens. It arrived as winters always did in northern Italy, late in the 14th century, by tightening the air and dulling the color of stone. Bellavigna lay behind his walls like a clenched fist, counting its dead with the same ink it used to count grain and tax. The plague had passed through the city the year before, leaving behind a habit of record-keeping that bordered on obsession. Every birth was written twice. Every death was witnessed. Every name was weighed against another name, to make sure nothing went missing again. That was how the discrepancy first appeared. Not in a chapel, not in a dream, not in the mouth of a frightened servant, but in the margins of a tax roll. A noble household, old, solvent, unremarkable in its loyalty, submitted an inheritance declaration naming an heir whose baptism could not be found. The clerk assumed error. Ink blots happened. Pages tore. Bells rang during storms and distracted scribes. He checked the parish register anyway. The page for that month was intact. The names before and after were present. Between them, there was a clean, deliberate absence, as if a line had been ruled and then respected. At the same time, another absence began to take shape elsewhere. In the same household, the firstborn child, the one whose birth had been celebrated during the plague winter, no longer appeared in memory with any firmness. Servants hesitated when asked how old the child would be. A midwife insisted she had attended the delivery, then withdrew the statement 2 days later and left the city before dawn. A wet nurse claimed never to have been employed, though her hands still bore the marks of recent labor. None of this provoked alarm. Bellavigna had learned to accept small gaps. Grief created them. Disease widened them. People stepped around what could not be faced. The house itself did not change its habits. Meals were served on time. Accounts were paid. Candles burned at the family chapel. Yet something subtle had shifted in how its history was being told. Portraits were moved. A likeness of a young mother was repainted. The curve of her arm altered so that it cradled nothing. An older painting, one showing a child at her feet, was retouched so that shadows swallowed the space where the child had been. These alterations were not announced. They were discovered slowly by visitors who could not explain why a room felt recently rearranged despite the dust. Whispers followed the changes, as they always did. The guild spoke of a black christening performed without priest or bell. The phrase had no fixed meaning. It was used when a child survived who should not have, or failed to appear where one was expected. The clergy heard the rumor and chose caution. Bellavigna had already lost too many to panic. Without proof, without a body or a confession, there would be no inquiry. The absence remained administrative, a matter of ink and silence. It hardened into something else when inheritance laws were quietly revised. A notary, summoned to update the family charter, discovered an addendum folded into the vellum, its creases old, its edges rubbed smooth by hands that had known where to look. The handwriting did not match any known scribe. It carried no seal of city or church. At its center was a simple sigil, a cradle drawn in a single unbroken line. Beneath it ran a clause written with legal precision, stating that an exchange once entered activated before the first cry, and that fulfillment conferred continuity where continuity was threatened. The notary did not read the clause aloud. He copied it. That was his error. Copies multiplied what should have remained singular. When the city council convened to review the charter, the clause was discussed as a curiosity, then as a problem. Some argued it was a forgery planted during the plague chaos. Others noted that the language predated the current generation by at least a century. No one could identify who had authorized it. No one could identify who had benefited first. As debate stalled, enforcement arrived from an unexpected direction. A servant, dismissed months earlier, returned to claim unpaid wages. She described a nursery that had been sealed on the night of the birth and never reopened. She described a cradle carried into a room and left untouched. Its wood pale against the dark walls. She described silence so complete it pressed against the ears. When she was asked why she had not spoken sooner, she answered that there had been no child to speak of, and then could not explain what she meant. The council ordered the house inspected. What they found did not violate any ordinance. The nursery existed. It was preserved with care. Dust lay thick on the floor, unbroken by foot or hand. The cradle stood where it had been placed, its linens yellowed, its curves worn smooth by age rather than use. There were no toys. There were no stains. The room bore the careful emptiness of a space intended to remain unused. The addendum was re-examined. This time, attention fixed on its margins, where earlier readers had left faint impressions. Names had been written there and pressed away. Dates had been added and erased. One notation, nearly invisible, aligned with the plague winter and the missing birth. It was not a signature. It was an acknowledgement. Bellavigna reacted as cities do when confronted with a problem that cannot be localized. The charter room was sealed to prevent rumor. The servant disappeared. The midwife's name was struck from the rolls. The family continued to prosper in small, defensible ways. Their grain stores did not spoil. Their debts did not compound. Their line did not falter. None of this was presented as cause and effect. It was recorded as coincidence. The cradle sigil began to surface elsewhere, faintly, like a watermark, on a trade contract reviewed by a guild clerk, on a marriage settlement filed in haste. Each appearance was accompanied by the same restraint. No seal, no witness, no explanation. The pattern was there for anyone trained to see patterns, but Bellavigna had learned to survive by ignoring them. The council's final act was procedural. Copies of the addendum and its marginal notes were prepared and dispatched to allied cities for comparison, a routine exchange among jurisdictions that shared law as much as blood. One packet was addressed to Prague, to a registrar known for his precision. The courier departed at dawn, carrying the documents wrapped in oilcloth against the cold. Behind him, the city returned to its habits. Bells rang, ledgers closed. The nursery remained sealed, its cradle unmoved, holding the shape of something that had been decided before the cry. And somewhere along the road north, the sigil traveled, intact, waiting to be recognized again. Prague's lesser town learned discretion the way other quarters learned trade. Its streets bent around stone houses that kept their accounts clean and their windows narrow, and the river carried away what the courts preferred not to hold. In the early 16th century, as crowns shifted and sermons hardened, the House of Karsov presented itself as an argument for order. Their ledgers were immaculate. Their rooms were spare. Their name appeared wherever stability was required, and disappeared when it was not. It was said that if the city were reduced to ash, Karsov records would survive the fire. The alteration began with a marriage announcement that did not ring the customary bells. The notice was posted at night and carried a vow sign without witnesses, a private affirmation replacing the lineage blessing expected of a house that prided itself on continuity. The omission drew no rebuke. Prague was crowded with exceptions, yet the clerks noticed a seal, black wax impressed with a cradle drawn in a single line. The same sigil would appear again, quietly, on deeds and bonds, always where inheritance touched blood. The first child of that marriage was recorded as having been sent away to tutors before the baptism could be scheduled. The phrasing was precise and repeated verbatim in later years. Sent away, tutors unnamed, return unspecified. The pattern solidified across decades. Firstborns departed. Younger siblings remained. The house did not grieve publicly. It did not petition for prayers. Its fortune steadied during years when famine cut other lines short. Grain arrived when roads were closed. Credit held when markets failed. The explanation offered was prudence. Neighbors reacted as neighbors do when envy needs structure. They counted windows. They counted mouths at table. They counted the years and noticed that no eldest child ever stood at the threshold to be counted back. The suspicion did not crystallize until the seal did. Black wax, cradle sigil, pressed into documents that crossed generations. When questioned, Karsov agents replied with copies, always copies, their margins clean of doubt. The university clerk encountered the anomaly by accident. While cataloging the Latin codex donated during a purge of monastic libraries, he found marginalia written in a disciplined hand, the ink darker than the text it flanked. The note referenced custodians of the First Light, a phrase not indexed in any theological register. It described an exchange bound to blood order and activated before sound. The clerk did not interpret. He cross-referenced. The phrase appeared nowhere else, except in a charter fragment from northern Italy, copied years earlier and dismissed as apocryphal. An inquest was convened and concluded with speed that suggested relief. Witnesses recanted with identical language. The clerk was reassigned. The codex was returned to its shelf with a strip of vellum pasted over the margin. Officially, nothing had been found. Unofficially, the House of Karsov sealed a stairwell that had long ended in a blank wall. Masons were summoned to brick it fully. The work took longer than expected. The wall retained warmth, as if the stone remembered passage. What remained were letters. 3 packets, written by 3 women across 3 decades, discovered later among effects sold to settle a minor estate. Each packet contained the same detail, phrased differently to avoid notice. A lullaby sung once and never again. The melody was not recorded. The words shifted. The effect did not. Each letter described a moment after the song ended, when the room felt complete and emptied at the same time. Each letter stopped short of naming what had been given. Authority moved as it does when confronted with consistency. An imperial auditor was ordered to Vienna to compare the Prague materials with older filings. The letters were included, sealed with the same black wax. The auditor did not read them on the road. He was known for patience. He trusted sequence. As the carriage crossed borders, the sigil traveled again, matching an older clause already waiting to be recognized. The coast taught the estate its own arithmetic. Wind subtracted warmth. Salt added weight to everything it touched. In the middle of the 17th century, along a headland that watched the Bristol Channel bruise itself against rock, a house stood with windows turned inward, as if the sea were something to be endured rather than admired. Parish books, there were practical documents, written by men who believed weather explained most things if you let it. Births were noted with dates and godparents. Stillbirths were marked with a steady hand. Nothing in the margins suggested an appetite for wonder. The disturbance arrived as cargo. After a winter storm tore a merchantman open on the shoals, the salvage court assembled to adjudicate what the sea had refused to keep. Nets delivered timbers, iron, and a single locked chest coated in salt and pitch. Its stamp survived the water. A cradle drawn in a single, unbroken line pressed into the lid. The mark shallow enough to be missed unless you knew to look for it. The chest was claimed by the lord of the estate under customary rights. No one objected. The sea had a way of assigning ownership without asking. Within the month, the parish recorded the birth of a firstborn son at the estate and, 2 lines later, his stillbirth. The entries were written by the same hand. The ink density matched. The dates agreed. Nothing in the record hinted at uncertainty. And yet the nursery told another story at night. Ash set by the hearth held the shape of small, wet footprints that appeared after the tide turned and vanished by morning. Smudged not by cleaning but by something passing through them. Servants noticed and said nothing. The wind made fools of anyone who argued with it. The household reacted with discipline. The nursery door remained closed. The mother did not appear at church for weeks, then returned without comment. The chest was carried down to a cellar, where the stones sweated salt even in summer. Fishermen spoke of lights offshore on the child's birthday, a line of pale fire lifting and falling with the swell. The explanation divided along familiar lines. The godly called it temptation. The maritime called it weather. Both agreed it was not for them. Escalation followed the law. A magistrate, pressed by rumors that threatened ordered the chest opened in daylight. The iron had not rusted. Inside lay vellum contracts, sea salted but legible, their language mirroring clauses already known elsewhere, the cradle sigil watermarking each page. The phrasing was careful, legal, and complete. Exchange. Activation before sound. Fulfillment conferring continuity. The magistrate read until the room grew quiet in a way weather could not explain. That night, the coastal watchman failed to return from his circuit. His lantern was found on the path, glass intact, wick burned low as if tended. The next tide pulled harder than expected. A tide ledger kept by an old pilot recorded the anomaly with the same precision he used for winds. Abnormal pull-on dates aligned with births. The pattern did not argue. It accumulated. Authority answered with fire, the last tool when paper refused to burn an ideal way. The estate was seized under lawful pretext and put to the torch. Roofs collapsed, walls smoked, the nursery window exposed to the heat. Fog as if breath pressed on the other side and did not clear. Handprints bloomed and faded again and again until the glass cracked and fell inward. One survivor fled with copies of the contracts wrapped in sailcloth, heading south toward Lisbon, where ledgers were said to remember everything. The coast returned to its habits. Wind subtracted warmth, salt added weight, and the sea kept its arithmetic, waiting for the next column to be filled. Lisbon learned to count differently after the ground taught it subtraction. When the earthquake came in the middle of the 18th century, it took churches and houses with equal indifference, then returned the city to itself rearranged. In the rebuilding that followed, order became a civic virtue, and numbers were trusted more than memory. Ledgers multiplied. Surveys hardened into law. In that climate, the House of Alvarenga prospered with a precision that felt almost charitable. Funds arrived when walls needed rising. Credit cleared when rubble still smoked. Their name appeared at the bottom of columns like a promise that held. The disturbance began with a revision. A census clerk, tasked with reconciling parish registers against municipal rolls, noticed that a cohort of firstborns had been erased across allied houses. Names struck cleanly, ages removed, entries collapsed into footnotes. The justification was technical. Duplicate filings during the reconstruction years. Misattributed baptisms. Corrections long overdue. The anomaly lay not in any single deletion, but in their alignment. The same families, the same order of birth, the same years. Prosperity curves rose as birth curves flattened. The math did not accuse. It suggested. Markets steadied where they should have swayed. Warehouses filled on time. Insurance underwriters slept. The social reaction turned bureaucratic, which is to say it quieted. Ministries harmonized records to maintain confidence. Questions were redirected. The city had learned that inquiry could topple walls as surely as fire. The clerk did not push. He compared. That was his mistake. In a storeroom where accounts were stacked to ceiling, he laid ledgers side by side and noticed a watermark that only appeared when pages were held to the light. A cradle drawn in a single, unbroken line. It marked accounts that should have had nothing in common: grain imports, shipping bonds, dowries, reconstruction grants. The sigil was never inked. It was part of the paper itself. He reported the finding up the chain and was commended for diligence. Then arrests were ordered, not of families, but of junior accounts accused of negligence. The stalls came from above, where signatures repeated with the same restraint the sigil demanded. The inquiry dissolved into procedure. The clerk was reassigned to bind damaged books. Among those books was a volume heavier than the rest. Its cover resisted dust. When opened, it revealed a master ledger bound in vellum that did not behave like vellum should. The surface was warm. The columns were ruled with care. Entries were labeled fulfilled and pending. Names were listed without dates of birth, only order: first, first, first. Each line concluded with a mark that matched the watermark seen elsewhere, impressed rather than written. The clerk closed the ledger and did not reopen it alone. When the volume was presented to Superior, the room emptied until only two remained. Decisions followed that did not leave ink trails. The ledger was to be secured, transported under guard, studied by those equipped to study it. In the meantime, Lisbon continued to rebuild. The haunting residue appeared in a place meant for consolation. On a church wall newly whitewashed after the quake, a procession of children emerged beneath layers of lime. No commission was recorded. No painter claimed the work. The figures advanced in single file, heads bowed, hands empty. There were no faces, only the suggestion of order. Parishioners passed without comment. The city had learned to step around what could not be fixed. When the ledger was shipped north under guard, its destination was Rome, to an archive closed since the Counter-Reformation, where fire had been planned for and truth kept cool. The guards reported nothing unusual on the road. They noted only the weight. In Lisbon, the numbers held, the houses endured, and the columns waited for settlement. Rome keeps its silences layered. Beneath streets worn smooth by processions and penance, There are rooms that have not heard a footstep in generations, their air held in place by doors designed to resist both fire and curiosity. In the early 19th century, one such archive was forced to remember itself. A small fire, contained and unremarkable by Roman standards, ate along a service corridor and licked at a seal wing closed since the Counter-Reformation. The blaze did not consume the shelves. It consumed the seals. Heat-warped iron just enough to loosen would have been made immovable. When the doors were open for inventory and repair, the work proceeded with a discipline Rome perfected long ago. Nothing was read aloud. Nothing was removed without countersignature. The ledgers from Lisbon arrived days later. Their escort relieved the surrender weight. They were placed on a table scarred by centuries of binding and unbinding. Light fell where it had not fallen in living memory. The trigger was proximity. Scrolls already housed in the archive answered the ledger without sound. Their vellum shared the same behavior, the same warmth, the same reluctance to lie flat. When unrolled, they revealed clauses written across eras in a hand that refused to age. The Cradle sigil appeared again, not as decoration but as structure, anchoring language that described custody rather than theft. The terms were explicit. The exchange stabilized houses and states when continuity faltered. The custodians did not take. They received what had been pledged before breath. An anomaly resolved into architecture. The pattern was no longer a chain of local bargains, but a system embedded into law through repetition and deference. Names reappeared across centuries, not as individuals, but as offices. Custodians of the first light, registrars of fulfillment, witnesses who never signed. The scrolls recorded not miracles, but compliance. Each entry a small correction applied to a world that threatened to break its own lines. Human reaction fractured into a silence. So practiced, it bordered on ritual. Those present recognized clauses they had enforced without knowing why. They saw language they had repeated because it had always been there. Complicity was not assigned. It was revealed. Orders were given to seal the wing again, this time with documentation that acknowledged the contents without describing them. The fire had been an interruption, not a summons. Escalation arrived anyway, carried by a date written where dates were never written. At the end of the oldest scroll, beneath a list of fulfilled exchanges, a final clause lay dormant until activated by accumulation. It was no longer optional. Settlement was due for all arrears at once. The date matched the present year. The language did not threaten. It concluded. The evidence prop that silenced the room was the original unsealed scroll, its edges darkened by hands that had known urgency. When lifted, it produced a sound like with shifting in an empty house. The sigil at its head had been pressed so deeply that it marked the table beneath. There were no instructions for refusal. There were no appeals. The haunting residue did not manifest as spectacle. It manifested as alignment. Across the archive cradles, objects cataloged for unrelated reasons, heirlooms confiscated centuries apart, began to move in unison, a soft rhythm carried through stone. The sound was not loud. It did not demand attention. It filled space the way a held breath fills a chest. By morning, the wing was sealed. Officially, the fire had been contained. Officially, the inventory had been updated. Unofficially, couriers were dispatched to cities whose ledgers had always balanced too neatly. There were no proclamations. Rome does not announce conclusions. The exchange did not end. It matured, folded into procedures refined to withstand reform. Somewhere, a cradle waited to be recorded as untouched. Somewhere, a first cry was accounted for before it could be heard. And the archives returned to their layered silence. Holding the cost had been deferred long enough to become ordinary,